So I'm going to guess that for the vast majority of you that saw the title of this video and clicked on it, one of the first bands, if not the first band that popped into your mind was Boston. I know it was for me. It's really hard to think of a more extreme case of a band that peaked on their debut album. There's an old saying in the music business that goes something like, you've got your whole life to write your first album and just a few months to write your second. Now, of course, that affects every band potentially, but once again, I think Boston is an extreme case here. Get this, Boston's debut album was released in August of 1976, and as early as 1973, Boston's guitarist, songwriter, and all-around mastermind Tom Scholz was mailing out demo tapes to record companies that contained songs like More Than a Feeling, Peace of Mind, Something About You, Rock and Roll Band, and a thing called San Francisco Day, which we all now know as Hitch a Ride. So clearly the guy had years to perfect this album into the masterpiece that it became. I think even the most casual rock fans must be aware of what a phenomenon this debut album was, selling 17 million in the US and over 20 million worldwide. And I don't think it's surprising that the vast majority of those sales came from the States. Boston has always seemed like a quintessentially American band to me from the name on down. It was actually the best-selling debut album of all time for a while before it was supplanted by things like Meatloaf's Bat Out of Hell, Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction, and a few others. So let's compare and contrast with the second Boston album, Don't Look Back. Now, following up something like Boston's debut has got to be a daunting task. And to be fair, by any stretch of the imagination, Don't Look Back was a huge commercial success. It sold around 7 million, which is phenomenal. How many acts will ever sell a fraction of that on a single album? But obviously just a little over a third of what the first album did. I think the obvious standout here is the title track, which for me is really the only tune on this record that would have been worthy of inclusion on the first album. When I first heard that track on the radio, I remember being very enthused. I thought it was very promising. But then a friend of mine down the street, an older guy, picked up the album and a bunch of us went over there to check it out. And I remember sitting there listening to it and thinking, yeah, it's okay, but it's just kind of more Boston. It was almost like they followed a template or something. And there's some very samey sounding things there. Just one little example, More Than a Feeling, everybody knows that intro. It's basically D sus4, C add 9, G/B. Now, compared to this bit from It's Easy off Don't Look Back, it's a bit close, isn't it? Then you had songs like Party, which to me sounds a bit like a cross between Smokin' and Rock and Roll Band from the first album. You've got the instrumental, The Journey, which is reminiscent of the great instrumental Foreplay, which opens the first album. It just didn't feel like they had broken any new ground here, even though it's all very competent. And even the cover art I thought was a bit unimaginative, a rehash of what they had done on the first album. I understand what they were going for, the spaceship theme, which they retained even after the second album. But I just much prefer a band like the Beatles or Led Zeppelin. You never knew what was coming on that next album cover. Something totally random, and that just added to the fun for me. The gap between these two records was 2 years, almost to the day. The second album came out in August of 1978. And while that might not seem like a really long time today, in the mid-70s, that was a long time. You were kind of expected to put out an album just about every year. But in spite of the 2-year cushion, Schultz says he felt pressured by his record company, Epic, to release the second album before it was ready. He's also complained that the runtime was ridiculously short. It clocks in at about 33 minutes, which is not a particularly long album. And all this is to say nothing of the band's next album, Third Stage, which didn't appear until 8 years after Don't Look Back. There were a number of reasons for this. Significantly, Tom Schultz's meticulous recording process, his perfectionism, and also a lawsuit. Epic Records got so frustrated waiting for this record that they sued the band, which of course only delayed things even more. So to sum up, I think it's undeniable that Tom Schultz is a genius who's written a handful of songs that will live forever. He's also an excellent guitarist and a brilliant electrical engineer who attended MIT and has created a number of analog effects that are available commercially and which he's used on his own music. But I just don't think he's a very prolific songwriter, and I think that accounts for the large gaps between the albums and the fact that he never managed to equal his first album. While it's true that Schultz recruited some amazing musicians to play on these records, obviously Brad Delp with his otherworldly vocal range, Barry Gaudreau, and many others, the vast majority of the songwriting credits go to Schultz alone, with a few notable exceptions. And I can't help wondering if he had just opened up that creative process a bit more to his colleagues, if the band's sound might have evolved and expanded into uncharted territory, leaving a legacy even more amazing than the one it already has.
I don't mind you hanging out and talking in your sleep. I guess you're just what I needed. Just what I needed. I needed someone to feed. I guess you're just what I needed. Just what I needed. I needed someone to bleed.
So right around the same time that Boston was finally delivering its long-awaited sophomore album, another new band called The Cars, also from Boston, as luck would have it, I'm not sure what they were putting in the water over there around this time, released their debut album, which took the rock world by storm in much the same way that Boston's debut had done back in '76. But while Boston was firmly entrenched in '70s hard rock / arena rock, albeit with fresh production values like we had never heard before, The Cars were a unique blend of that type of rock mixed with elements from the emerging new wave scene, and that produced a style that could be appreciated both by die-hard rockers like my young self, as well as more trendy types from the new wave scene. The Cars' fashion sense, quirky, somewhat artsy lyrics, and keyboard sounds all trended toward the new wave. Now, of course, classic rock bands like Boston had been using keyboards for a long time, but they tended to go for more traditional sounds, Hammond B3s and whatnot, whereas Cars keyboardist Greg Hawkes, just for example, on Just What I Needed, used a Mini Korg 700. not always a fan of those late 70s, early 80s, new wavy keyboard tones, but that's a great sound there. I love it. The Cars' debut has racked up sales of over 6 million over the years. I actually thought it would have been even more than that. But it had 3 hit singles, Just What I Needed, My Best Friend's Girl, and Good Times Roll. But maybe even more significantly, the album contains several tracks that were never singles but have become enduring radio hits. You're All I've Got Tonight, Bye Bye Love, Moving in Stereo, and All Mixed Up. That was the entirety of side 2 that I just rattled off there. And those are all songs that are heard regularly to this day. And of course, Moving in Stereo will forever live in infamy for its use in the film Fast Times at Ridgemont High. I'm not going to elaborate on that one. If you know, you know. Now, this is obviously a personal opinion, but I feel that the Cars' second album, Candy-O, was a more impressive follow-up than Boston's Don't Look Back. I'm sure I'll get some disagreement on that. It actually outperformed the debut album on the charts, peaking at number 3, whereas the Cars album only made it to number 18. Now, obviously, the second album always has that advantage of the band being a known quantity right out the gate. Hearing Candy-O for the first time, I didn't get that same sense of disappointment that I got from Don't Look Back. In fact, back then, I think I believed that the second album was just as good as the first. In retrospect, I think the first album is by far the better. But Candy-O was solid and successful. There were 3 singles released: Let's Go, It's All I Can Do, and Double Life, although Double Life failed to chart at all. To date, Candy-O has racked up sales of around 4 million. Very impressive, but not matching the sales for the debut. In fact, that's part of why the band is included in this video on groups that peaked with their debut album. The Cars never matched the 6 million in sales of the first album until they released their greatest hits years later in the 80s, but that doesn't really count, does it? Candy-O was followed up by Panorama, a very experimental album that underperformed both commercially and critically. Although I kind of respect it, the fact that the lead single, Touch and Go, great song in my opinion, is in 5/4 time shows that they were not playing it safe with this one. To be precise, it starts out in 5/4 for the intro and verse. Then leading into the pre-chorus, we get one quick measure of 6/4, and then into a steady 4/4 for the pre-chorus and chorus. I love it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 1, 2, 3, 4. 1, 2, 3, 4. And post Panorama, I think the Cars really became a whole other group. Not so much rock or new wave, but a pop band. Sure, you still had Elliot Easton's ripping guitar solos from time to time. But drummer David Robinson was increasingly replaced by a drum machine, and I really missed his sort of relaxed rock and roll groove. But regardless of what I thought, the general public ate it up. 1981's Shake It Up produced the band's first top 10 single, the title track, and 1984's Heartbeat City was even bigger. It produced the single Drive, which at number 3 was the band's highest charting single ever. And those 2 tracks illustrate for me what is one of the coolest elements of the Cars, the fact that they had 2 lead vocalists. That is almost unheard of today in rock and roll, and it really bothers me. You had rhythm guitarist Rick Ocasek, who was also the band's songwriter. Much like Tom Scholz in Boston, Ocasek was absolutely the mastermind of the Cars. But then you also had bass player Benjamin Orr, who had a much more conventional rock and roll aesthetic and a much more conventional rock and roll voice. Ocasek did the lead vocal on Shake It Up, and Orr handled the lead on Drive.
You can't go wrong thinking nothing's wrong. Who's gonna drive you home tonight?
So bottom line, even though the Cars scored some of their greatest commercial successes years after the release of the first album, I still think the songs they will be most remembered for are from that classic debut. Just What I Needed, My Best Friend's Girl, and so on. And I think if you polled any number of rock and roll fans and asked them, what is your favorite Cars album? I bet you anything that the debut would come up number one. But maybe you guys disagree. Let me know. Is there a Cars album you like better? I'd love to hear about it. Of course, if you're watching these videos and liking them, please consider subscribing, and financial contributions are very much appreciated. Look in the description to see the various ways you can do that. Talk to you soon.